So before I leap into talking about sexual assault, because it's always something that we are looking to talk about at noon in the middle of the week, I am going to give you a little bit information on my journey as a storyteller, because it was as a storyteller that I decided to do this form of activism by telling this story. I first got pulled into the world of arts by my second grade teacher, Miss Suzuki. Her name was my hardest spelling word in second grade. I still remember it, Czyzewski. Learned how to say her name by sneezing it, Miss Suzuki. And she asked me to be the narrator for our Christmas play, which was "'Twas the Night Before Christmas" went all through the house. And standing on that 1-foot high stage in the basement of my Catholic grade school, the bug bit, and I knew I was going into theater. And exactly 20 years later, I was in graduate school getting my MFA in directing for the stage. And I had made friends quite accidentally with the child drama teacher. His office was across from my office. And so I ended up becoming friends with him simply because we saw each other when we looked up from our desks. And I was complaining to him one night that as a theater director, I was going to make my living as a temp secretary for the rest of my life. He said, "There's this thing you do. You do it in my office and you do it at lunch, and I suspect you do it in the women's restroom, and it's called storytelling, and people get paid for it." So I went into storytelling for the big money it would get me. My thought being that I would use one freelance art career to support another freelance art career, which shows you just how few business classes I had taken. But I found very quickly that storytelling was what I'd actually fallen in love with when I was 7. I just hadn't had the word for it. Language is so important, having the right words for things. And so I came out of graduate school with an MFA and as a storyteller. And from there, I ended up having, before I came here to ETSU, I had a 32-year career as a freelance storyteller, which means everything from telling ghost stories on a junior high hayride with a bullhorn for amplification to working with lawyers on crafting opening statements. Story exists everywhere in our lives, and so I ended up working in a wide variety of situations. But when I first got into storytelling, I was pretty focused on telling folktales instead of telling personal stories. I had seen some absolutely brilliant autobiographical storytelling that befuddled me. I knew it was brilliant, but I couldn't for the life of me figure out how the storytellers were doing it. So I couldn't imagine that I could do it. And I had also seen some really, really bad autobiographical storytelling that was essentially therapy on stage. And I not only was sure that I could end up doing that, I was terrified that I would do that. So I avoided autobiographical storytelling. And then 3 years into my journey as a storyteller, I ended up taking a week-long workshop from Lynn Rubright, who is one of the people who helped get the Renaissance of storytelling going in the 70s. And we ended up with one day where we were assigned to tell a family story in the class. And the day that we were telling that story in class was the 15th anniversary of my father's death. And I was 30 years old, so he would have been with me for the first half of my life and gone for the second half of my life. And so it seemed to make sense to do a story about him. And that was my first experience of taking a story that had some darker elements in it, because I did talk about his death and the week of his death. But I also had some much lighter moments from in his life and from my childhood. And it was my first experience combining the dark with the light and using humor to be able to tell stories about some of the shadow sides of human life. And that broke me through into telling autobiographical stories. And I would say my career was not just as a storyteller. I also did a lot of work as a story coach, used that MFA in directing to do a lot of work as a story coach for other people, and got to the point where I specialized in working with people on difficult autobiographical stories. So I knew that at some point I wanted to take the story about my own sexual assault and take it to college campuses. There were a variety of reasons why I wanted to do that. It was my form of doing activism around the topic. If I had been a biology major, I would have been focused on helping clear old rape kits that were backed up. If I had, been a journalist, I would have been covering these kinds of stories, but I'm a storyteller. So the thing that I have that I can do is tell a story. And the idea of telling the story was always that, first and foremost, I wanted other survivors to know that they weren't alone, because I knew that in my journey as a survivor, I had felt very alone for many, many, many years. I also wanted to give language to the experience. When I was first assaulted, I did not apply the word rape to it. It was only a year and a half after the assault when I was trying to describe to a boyfriend at the time this terrible thing that had happened to me about a year and a half before. He listened to my description and he said, "Nancy, that's rape. You were raped." And as soon as he said that, I was like, oh, he's right. Why did I not attach that word to it? And I did not attach the word to it because I had been raised thinking that rape was something that happened in an alley with a stranger with a weapon, and not something that happened with someone that you trust, and someone that you care about. So to me, I also, for this event that can be very confusing, especially for people who are assaulted by someone they know and trust, I wanted to put language to it. And I wanted to model the fact that we get to talk about the shadows in our lives. We get to tell stories about them and own those stories as much as we own the lighter, joyful stories in our life as well. So I had a lot of reasons why I wanted to take this to campus. But I could not find my way into the story. I couldn't find a way that it wouldn't be just a story about rape. And I knew that I didn't want to do therapy on stage. I'd seen people do it and I didn't want to. And I knew that one of the things I needed was to find the universals in the story, so that people who had not been through the same experience could still see themselves in the story. And I wasn't finding that door in. So there were 15 years where I knew that I wanted to tell this story, but I held back from doing it. But even though I hadn't told the story artistically, I had told the story quite a bit therapeutically. I had tried to go to a counselor while I was still in college. They had not been able to give me language for it either. It was not very helpful. But once I was out of college, I was having all kinds of physical problems that I eventually connected to the rape. I had terrible TMJ. I couldn't open my mouth even wide enough to get a McDonald's French fry into it. I was having all sorts of bleeding problems. I was having panic attacks. And I finally decided I need to find somebody professional who can help me with this. So in my early-ish 20s, I found a therapist, and to him, I told this story over and over and over and over again, trying to find the way that I could tell it to myself, in which I could make sense of it and actually find a place for it in my life. And during that period, I went from trying to erase the story from my life and pretend that it had never existed, which ended up erasing a lot of other things. If I was going to pretend this had never happened, then college never happened, and my friends from college had never happened. And it started eating up a lot of other stories in my life to get rid of it. And then when I went through a phase where it was the only story I had, and I believe I was telling people about it, strangers on the subway in Chicago were hearing about it. It was the only story I had, which was just another way of eating up all the rest of my stories. But I finally, in therapy, got to the point where I found a way to integrate it into my life. And that happened right around the time that I got into graduate school. And in that 15 years of wanting to tell this story and knowing that I wanted to find a universal, I don't consider those 15 years of not telling it a waste of time. I consider it time where I was growing as a storyteller and developing the skills to actually be able to tell a story like this as art and as advocacy. Because the therapeutic story and the advocacy story have really, really different goals. So I'm going to share with you some of the tools that I use and the insights that I had that helped me turn this very dark event into a story that I use for advocacy. So I'm going to share screen just for a moment. I am not a PowerPoint girl, so we are not going to get a bunch of PowerPoints. I am a storyteller, so you'll be seeing my face through most of this, but I do want to share one graphic with you. Let me see if I can get to it. There we go. Are you all seeing a triangle with storyteller and audience? Yay. This is the fundamental thing that I teach to all my storytelling students, and it is a set of relationships and dynamics that I use for every story I craft, and not just the hard ones. And there is the relationship between the story and the teller, the relationship between the teller and the audience, and a relationship that forms between the audience and the story. And when I'm telling an artistic story, my focus is on the audience, and my goal is to actually, I don't know if you can see my cursor moving around, but my goal is to have a strong relationship between the story and the audience. How do I tell this story in a way that the audience walks away with it in a way that is meaningful to them and is, that's why it's so important to find universals. How do I find a way for the audience to see themselves in this story? However, in the therapeutic relationship, the focus is not on the audience. The focus is actually on the teller, and the audience is the therapist. And it's the therapist's job as audience to work on this relationship between the story and the teller. How does the teller of that story get to a point where they're telling the story in a way that it can fit into their lives? And so who you're focused on is fundamentally different between the therapeutic story and the artistic story. And the advocacy story just goes one more step in that it's not just that you want to bind the audience to the story, you also want the audience to change in some way, change how they think, change how they act, change what they believe. You are trying to be an advocate for people who have been through this experience and change perceptions for people in the audience. So in order to do that, I wasn't sure if there would be new people show up once I stopped sharing the screen. One of the tools that I use is, I'm actually going to go back to that screen for a second. I got off of it too quickly. One of the tools that I use for discovering universals is, we're going to move down to the next page of this, finding universals in your story. These are handouts that I give in every class I teach. So I go looking for the images in a story and the themes in a story. We need concrete images and universal themes. And the images are there to engage the imagination, to make the story real to the audience. And it's all of the concrete sensories of a story, what something looks like, what it sounds like, what it smells like, what it tastes like, and also physical movement, the movement of body in space. That is part of a story. And then the universal themes are the things that help the audience connect emotionally to the story. So what fundamental aspect of being human is the story exploring? What's the story about that is larger than just its events? That's one of the questions that I ask myself a lot. What is larger than just the events of the story? And that is something that stopped me for those 14 years because I couldn't figure out what was bigger than the topic of rape. And yet at the same time, I didn't want to tell a story where the essential theme is rape is bad, because people already know that. And so I needed to have something else. It took me 15 years to get to that point. And the thing that finally helped me find my way into the story was I lived in Chicago for the first 40 years of my life. And then in 2001, I moved to Minnesota. And the very first storytelling thing that I was asked to do when I was in Minnesota had a theme of knowing better. And you might think that, oh, now I knew what my universal was in my story. It never even occurred to me to tell the story about a sexual assault from the theme of knowing better. Instead, I told a story about my college love, my big college love, a relationship that started in high school but ended in college. And all the time that I had frittered away in my 20s and 30s, late at night, staying up, not able to sleep, thinking about all the what ifs. What if I had done this? Would we still be together? What if this could happen? Would we still end up together? What if, what if, what if, what if? And it was about this lost love and the tricks our brains play on us, trying to wish parts of our past away and wish new futures in. And the night after I performed it, I couldn't sleep. I just couldn't sleep. And in the middle of the night, I had this sudden aha that the biggest what if that I really had that I didn't have in the story was, what if I hadn't been raped in college? If I hadn't been raped in college, would he and I have still ended up staying together? And that got me up and out of bed and out onto the couch. And I took a journal, and I have to say I have a habit of buying journals because they have beautiful covers, and I'm always sure that I'm going to write in them. And I have a row of empty journals because I'm just not a journaler. But I picked one of those journals off the shelf, and I sat down and I wrote 11 and a half pages. And in doing that, I ended up having the basic outline for being able to do my first version of a public version of this story and finding the art in, because, and that first show was called The Attack of the Killer What Ifs. And it really was about, what if one story in your life tries to eat up all the other stories? And I had a universal that other people could connect to, even if their story that was eating up their lives was not a story about rape. So that's how the story first came out. I also was very lucky that in Minneapolis, St. Paul, there's a huge fringe festival once a year. And so I could apply to be part of that fringe festival. And if I got in, I could have an hour to do anything I wanted. It was completely uncensored. I could do a show. I would have a theater. I would have a tech crew. And the audience could self-select for coming, because that's one of the hardest things with a story like this is, how do you find an audience that actually wants to hear a story like this? So, and how do you find the opportunity to actually get it out into the world? So I got it out there through doing that. And I did it a few more times over the years. I did it at a storytelling conference. I told it at a couple of festivals. And then in 2008, I started touring it to colleges. And I had to change it a lot when I started touring it to colleges, because when I had told it for the Fringe Festival, it was for a general public audience, so a wide range of ages. And I told it with the frame of the story about my boyfriend and discovering this big what if I hadn't been raped. And it was all about looking, at that point I was in my early 40s. It was about looking back in the past from your early 40s. But if you're going into a college to talk to college age students, they don't care about your early 40s. It is not of interest to them. They are not looking back in a nostalgic, how have I wasted time in my life, what ifing? That's of no interest to them. So I had to get much more focused immediately on, I put much more into the story about what was it like for me to still be in college after this happened. And it became much more a crafting of my healing journey after the event. So that, well, I'll talk about that a little bit more later. So I started touring into colleges in 2008. And then in 2010, I got invited to participate in the first ever National Story Slam, which Judy mentioned at the beginning of this. And they didn't have a theme. We could use whatever story we wanted. And I thought, what's the story that is dearest to my heart right now? And it was this story. And touring it to colleges was about 75 minutes long. And I was still leaving out tremendous amounts of things, but it was about 75 minutes. But for the slam, which is a storytelling competition, I had to get it down to 5 to 6 minutes. And that's a story in itself of how I took a 25-minute show and got it down to 5 to 6 minutes. But, you know, suffice to say, I had to leave out a tremendous amount of things. And I'm going to actually play for you the audio, the Chicago Public Radio, the National Story Slam took place in Chicago. So I got to go back to my hometown for it. And our local public radio station, WBEZ, came and recorded all the stories and did a feature on the first ever National Story Slam. And they ended up playing my story on the air. And so I'm just going to let you listen to it as I told it in 2010. So this is not the 75-minute version. Has to be afeared of that. Okay. I am missing. Oh, no, here it is. I tried to close as many windows as I could before I got on this, but I still had a bunch of them. Oh, wait a minute. I need to optimize sound. There we go. I've got them set. I'm sorry I don't have video, but here it is to listen to.
This past weekend, the first ever National Story Slam took place in Chicago. The winner, Nancy Donoval, represented the Twin Cities. Now, we're not ones to ever pass up a good story, so without further ado, here is the winner of the first ever National Story Slam, Nancy Donoval, performing her story, Bump. One warning, it does involve drinking and some adult situations.
I have a bump in the center of my forehead. The doctor told me that it was a bone spur, but I needed a better reason than that. Why the tectonic plates of my forehead kept shifting in such a way to push it up a little higher every year. And then it came to me. I was becoming a unicorn. Now that made sense to me. See, in medieval lore, the only way that you could capture a unicorn was by using a virgin as bait. And I had wanted my virginity back for so many years. that my body finally got with the program and started turning me into a unicorn, sort of like it would work in reverse. And if I were a unicorn, I could recapture my virginity. Now, I don't want any of you to get all caught up in the suspense of whether or not I ever did get my virginity back. Because I did. It was given back to me by a lovely young man named Ed. There's nobody like Ed. Ed double majored in theater and metallurgical engineering. He wasn't very chatty, but he had a vocabulary of 32 distinctly different shrugs, and I learned how to interpret each of them. Ed, when I met him in graduate school, was a 26-year-old heterosexual theater guy who was still a virgin. We were laying on his scratchy blue rug one night drawing patterns on each other's skin, and it just blurted out of me, I wish I could be a virgin again like you. Huh. Not chatty. Huh. Okay. You are. Who knew it could be that simple? Now, Ed gave me back something so much more than my virginity. He gave me back the name Ed. Because until I met him, any variation of that name could trigger me. Edward, Edgar, Edwin, Mr. Ed Rerun, even a takeout menu from Eduardo's Pizza could make a rabbit hole open under my feet, and I would fall in, and I would fall all the way back to 19 years old, all the way back to Eddie. Not Ed, Eddie. I was drinking a lot that night, but it was planned drinking. I was a freshman theater major, and I'd never been drunk, and I needed to know what it felt like so I would have the sense memory to draw on later when I had to act it. Eddie volunteered to come along to keep me out of trouble. When he suggested that we leave the bar and go back to the frat house where the alcohol was free, I didn't give it a second thought. This was Eddie. He was one of my few real friends in the theater department. He was raised strictly Baptist, like I was raised strictly Catholic, and we would drive around in his Chevy Impala and talk about religion and theater and school and our families. Eddie, who treated me like I was his kid sister and appointed himself my sober bodyguard. It's funny how alcohol affects different people differently. I lose motor control right away, but I remember everything. What I was wearing. White painter's pants, a brown knit shirt, and a matching heart-shaped agate choker. What I had for lunch that day, a Wendy's single with cheese, no pickle. I remember thinking, yes, when Eddie kissed me at the frat house, yes, he doesn't see me as his kid sister anymore. I remember when the yes became a no. Sobbing, no. Trying to scream, no, but a hand over my mouth and a voice, his voice, my friend's voice, saying, be quiet. I remember sitting on the shower floor back at the dorm and realizing that I couldn't kill myself because my dad had died just a few years before and I couldn't do that to my mom. I remember feeling relief at having that option taken off the table, but having absolutely no idea what to replace it with. I remember the long, hard crawl out of that rabbit hole and all the people I met along the way who whispered "me too" in my ear. And finally, I remember Ed, not Eddie, but Ed, who lay with me on that scratchy blue carpet and gave me back my virginity and Eduardo's Pizza. Wikipedia says that the reason why unicorns were so prized was because it was believed that their horns could neutralize poison. I have a bump in the center of my forehead.
That was Nancy Donoval, the winner of the first ever National Story Slam. The competition took place this weekend in Chicago. We have more National Story Slam stories at
bez.org
Oh, he's just gonna keep talking.
848.
Okay. Now I can see your smiling faces again. So I want to break down some of the choices that I made in telling the long version of the story, but some of them are reflected in the short version as well. And I want to be clear that this slam version is essentially the very beginning of the long show and the very end of the long show. When I tell the story in the long version, my image of it in structure is that it's a spiral where I start pretty far out from the actual assault and I keep spiraling closer to it. And sometimes it seems like I'm getting very close to it and then I go back out again. And then I get closer to it and I go back out again. I want people in the audience to almost be impatient for, are you going to talk about it already? It seems like you're going to talk about it, but when are we getting there? And we get there very close to the end of the whole show. So one of the first things that's important when I am doing this story is that at the very beginning of the story, I am showing the audience, demonstrating to them that I'm okay, that they don't have to worry about me, that even though, because if I go to college campuses, they all know the topic that the story is going to be. And I have to show them that I'm not going to disintegrate up on stage and they're not going to have to take care of me. And I do that in a couple of ways. I have humor early in the story. That unicorn does a great service to me. I didn't make anything up in this story. This is all true. I did go through the whole thing of thinking, oh my God, I'm transforming into a unicorn. This is all, none of it is fictionalized, but I selected things that enabled me to have a comedic frame and a very imagistic physical frame of this bump on my forehead to lead me into the story. I'm also really particular about what I wear when I tell this story. When I first started touring campuses, I went out and I bought a very a geometric, very bright primary red color shirt. And because I had gone through a patch after the assault, and I hadn't even realized I was doing it. I had a therapist point it out to me, which is how I realized I was doing it, where all I wore was black, navy, and brown. I had eliminated color from being on my body. I was trying to get invisible so that nobody saw me. So I don't say anything about I'm wearing red. I don't make a big deal out of it. I try to wear clothes that are not really, really baggy so that it's not that I'm trying to hide my body. I just want to present as someone who is comfortable inside themselves and who still has a sense of humor, that I'm not broken beyond fixing. So that's something that I do very clearly in the story. The other thing that, man, when I was trying to decide how to do a 5 to 6 minute version of this story, what needed to be in there, I knew that I had to have an example, a positive example of a man in my life, to go with the negative example of a man in my life. I needed to not have it be for men in the audience that the only man they saw in the story was a rapist. It would push them out of the story. It would make them feel blamed. It would make them feel like possibly that I was a man hater. I can't tell you the number of schools that I've been to where people came up to me afterwards, often the people who hired me, who said, oh, our men respond so well to you, with this total shock in their voices about how well the men respond to me. And then they'll say very confidentially, you're not one of those angry feminists, which I usually respond, oh, yes, I am. I am a feminist, and not only am I feminist, I'm an angry one. And the thing that makes me angriest, it depends on what my relationship is with the person, but I sometimes will say the thing that makes me angriest is when I'm not allowed to be angry about sexual assault. That really ticks me off. but I don't present anger in the story, and I don't, and it's very deliberate. It would be easy to do so, but people are so looking for a way to discount you and be able to say, oh, that's just one of those man haters. They cry rape all the time, that I need to not give them ammunition for that. And I want there to be positive role models for men in the story as well. So it's not just, here is a negative role model. So for telling an advocacy story, my question at the very beginning of it, because I have people who come to me who want to tell advocacy stories and they're ready to leap in and they know the story they want, and it's usually a traumatic story from their life. And my question is always, why are you telling this story to this particular audience in this moment in time? That they have to know the why of it. Because if it's just, I'm compelled to tell this story, there's a fair chance that what they're about to tell is the therapeutic version. That it's, I have to get this story out, I need this story to be heard, as opposed to, what are you trying to accomplish with the audience? So I have some things that I'm very specifically trying to accomplish with my audience. The first and biggest umbrella one for them is that I'm trying to model lack of shame. I just want it clear that a survivor can talk about this and not be ashamed of their behavior before, during, or after. I want to give humanity to statistics. An example of that is, I mean, just by telling my story right there, I'm giving a face to statistics. But I think about this statistic of, depending on the study that's quoted, it's 1 in 5 or 1 in 4 or 1 in 3 women will experience sexual assault at some point in their life. And quoting those statistics with a PowerPoint slide, people just go, ooh, 1 in 5, 1 in 4, that's horrible. And what I want to demonstrate is we all know somebody who's been through this, whether we know that we know somebody or not. So in my story, after I go through therapy and I actually start telling some of the people I'm closest to in my life that I didn't tell when I was trying to pretend this story wasn't part of it, I tell and again, all of this is true, I tell my best friend from 4th grade. And at that point, I still thought I was the only person I knew who had experienced sexual assault, until my best friend from 4th grade told me about being raped when we were 16 by a boyfriend of hers. And my cousin told me about the sexual abuse that she'd experienced from her father. And one of my best friends from college told me about the foreign exchange student who assaulted her when she was 11. And I just started collecting these stories from people and being astounded that all these people I loved had been through something so horrible and I had not known. So that's putting a face and a real life, how does that feel, to the idea of we all know somebody. And it's more effective than me just saying, we all know somebody. All of you know somebody. That's too much waving a finger at them. And I'm really careful not to do that. For survivors, I always think of survivors first. I'm very aware that any audience that I'm going to be in, there will be survivors. So for them, there's a lot of things that I'm trying to do for them, but the two biggest ones are, I'm trying to hold the paradox of, as badly as this impacted you, you're not overreacting. It really does feel that bad. It really is that awful. And I talk about the impact that it had on me. I talk about almost flunking out of college. I tell stories about how badly it impacted me. But I'm also holding out the other half of the paradox, which is, it is possible to get better. You can get better. You can heal from this. And I'm trying to hold them at the same time. so that it's not about this is awful and we're going to be stuck there forever. It's this is awful, but you can come back to the light. And one of the things that I try modeling in the story is the importance of going to a professional counselor, a professional therapist. I would say that in most stories, if you spend significant time talking about your therapy, you are going to lose your audience, and it's probably not a good choice. Let me tell you about my relationship with my therapist. But I end up talking about trying to find a therapist and essentially speed dating for therapists, where I found, all right, this one has no sense of humor. I can't talk to them. And this one kind of gives me creep me out vibes. I can't be with them. And this one, so that they get that you don't just go to one therapist, and if it doesn't work, then that's it, you're done. And I spend some time talking about what did I get from the therapeutic relationship that I couldn't get from just friends in my life. And again, it's why story is powerful instead of just saying, and I strongly recommend that you go and find a therapist. We can say things like that, but it's the story of what do you get from it? And this is what I did that actually is powerful. For friends of survivors, they are the people who come up and talk to me the most after I do this show at campuses or elsewhere. I hear a lot of survivor stories. People come up to me, and sometimes, quite often, I'm the first person they've told. And I'm used to hearing those stories. I'm good at hearing those stories. I can take them in. And thank God I still have a therapist of my own, so I can go clear afterwards, because it's hard to carry a bunch of those stories around, but I managed to do it. But the people who come up to me the most are the people who love survivors, who don't know what to do to help them. And what do I do? What do I do for my friend? So I have sections in the story that both demonstrate the don'ts, because I certainly had a lot of people that responded in a really bad way to me telling them. And so I have some of the don'ts in there, but I also have some of the do's of what it is that I really wanted that I had trouble finding. So, I put that in for them. There was something else I wanted to say about that. Oh, when I'm modeling when I'm talking about the don'ts, I actually fess up to me not being the best person at hearing these stories at this point. And I talk about when my friend from 4th grade tells me that she was raped when we were 16. My first response is, what? Like, I got angry at her. This happened when we were 16 and you didn't tell me? How could you not have told me? And then I realized that, like, mine had happened 7 years before and I hadn't told her, and possibly getting angry at her is not the most supportive way of hearing this story. So I show that even somebody who's enlightened can be, can go in the wrong direction when they're hearing a story like this, that it's tough. I'm trying to make sure that people don't end up feeling shamed. I'm not just trying to work on taking the shame out for survivors. I'm also trying to shake the shame out for people who are trying to support survivors. If you shame somebody, they just shut down. So I have them, and there's a bunch of things in the story for them. I'm also aware that in my audience, I quite possibly have perpetrators or potential perpetrators. And I'm very particular in the story. And when I first was putting it together for the Fringe show, this was the hardest thing for me to do. I let Eddie, not Ed, but Eddie, be a three-dimensional person. I talk about when we were friends. I talk about how he was one of my best friends in the theater department. I talk about having a crush on him and how we drove back and forth to the airport and all these things that we talked about. I talk about those things because I need men in the audience to be able to see themselves in him. If I just make him the villain twirling his mustache, and he's just unremittingly bad, then men won't see themselves in him. And they will discount it as, well, I'm not a rapist. I couldn't be a rapist. I don't know any rapists. This is just a bad guy. And I'm also trying to combat the rape myth that, nice guys couldn't do this. Because the same way that we all know survivors, we probably all know a perpetrator or two that we would find incredibly difficult to believe that they're a perpetrator. And so humanizing the perpetrator is really important. That was really hard for me to go back into the space of when he was a friend, because after his betrayal, it was just hard to re-enter those emotions. But it was necessary for telling the story I was trying to tell. I also have stuff in there for skeptics, people who think that women just cry rape at the drop of a hat. I have sections that deconstruct rape myths. I have a section that works on explaining counterintuitive behaviors. For example, I was still in the theater department with Eddie for another year and a half after he raped me. And for the first, almost the entire time that he was there, I still did not have the word for what he'd done to me, but I had to figure out a way to be with him. And that sounds like there's logic involved in it, but there wasn't any logic involved in it. There was survival involved in it. It's like I was drowning. And I say this in the story. It's like I was drowning and a piece of driftwood came by and I grabbed onto that driftwood and I did not stop to think, is this driftwood strong enough to hold me? Or does this driftwood have a poisonous snake on it that's going to make things worse? I'm drowning. I'm grabbing the wood that comes past. So one of the first pieces of driftwood that came past for me was that I ended up thinking in terms of like, oh, I need to be a better friend to him. And I used to feel so much shame about that. Oh my God, talk about deconstructing shame. Afterwards, when I was on the other side of it, I was like, you what? You're going to become a better friend to him? I was so mad at my 19, 20-year-old self for doing that. But when I really took it apart, because I was doing this show and I did not want to shame anybody in the audience who did counterintuitive behaviors, I finally realized that I was trying, that somewhere in there was this idea that if I was a better friend to him, he'd become a better person, and retroactively, it could never have happened. That if he became a better person, he would become a person who couldn't possibly have done this. And that would make it go away, because my biggest wish was that it would go away. And so I became a better friend to him for a while. So I just think of all those, news stories where people say, well, he can't possibly have raped her. I saw them having lunch 2 days later. And I'm trying to give an example of that and explain why that can happen. So I'm there trying to explain counterintuitive behaviors for the skeptics, but also for survivors who are in the same place of like, how could I have done that afterwards? And I started dating him and oh my God, I married him. I'm trying to say we survive, and the way we survive, we're not going to judge it. I ended up, and the way that I ended up being able to do that, and this is going to be one of the last things I talk about, is so I had all this shame for why was I drinking that night? Why did I drink so much? And why did I stay a friend with him afterwards? And things that I did during the rape to reframe it in my own head, just boatloads of shame. And you would think that I had cleared all of that out in therapy, but I hadn't. I had dealt with sort of the big picture of the story, but I hadn't managed to get to all these pockets of shame. And the more that I worked on the story for telling it to an audience, the more I found pockets of shame, and I knew I couldn't be feeling that shame while I told the story. So it gave me the impetus to do some internal work that I probably wouldn't have done if it wasn't for, I am doing this for the benefit of my audience, as opposed to the benefit for myself. Because I wasn't telling this story in order to heal myself. I was telling this story in order to present the possibility of healing for others. If I was telling it for myself, I'd be telling it for the wrong reason. And the fact that I got some extra bonus healing was a byproduct of the creative process as opposed to my intended goal. So I finally started looking at my 19 and 20-year-old self in the third person, where I stopped thinking of it as me and I. I started thinking about it as her. And I started thinking about her. Would I be responding this way if my 19-year-old niece had something like this happen to her? Would I be judging her the way I'm judging my 19 and 20-year-old self? And oh my God, not in a million years would I judge in that way. I would be like, honey, you're doing the best you can. And anything you did to stay alive is really important. And, I would have tremendous compassion. And so I started showing that compassion to my 19 and 20-year-old self. This is really how I got to the point where I could tell the story, was by separating myself from my 19 and 20-year-old self and being able to look back on them as young people who were doing their very best. And I got to not only a compassion place, I ended up getting to a gratitude place. Your only job was to stay alive, and you managed to do that. So staying alive was your job, and you did it, and thank you. I have an example of how I managed to deconstruct shame for loved ones who did the wrong thing, but I think I want to stop at this point because I want to leave room for if there are any questions, and I know we're close to the end of time. So I just want to see, there are so many things that go into it, so many decisions that go into this, and every one of them is with the frame of what does the audience need to get what they need to get from this story. So do people have questions or comments? It's any of that.
Thank you for such a powerful story. Yeah, certainly somebody has questions.
I'm going to look in chat and see if there's any questions.
How long did it take you to formulate such a long story, 75 minutes of talking with all the different themes? Like, how long were you working on it before you presented it?
About 8 months. Doing a long story is so much easier than doing a short story. Because you're not saying I'm throwing everything out and what are the, 3 things that get left in. So it's harder and takes longer to keep. I'm still at the point trying to get it down to be a 45-minute story, which is being between the 7-minute and the 75-minute. I find it harder to, oh my God, if I take this piece out, I'm not serving friends. Oh my God, if I take this piece out, I'm not saying what I need to say to potential perpetrators. Oh my God, if I take this piece out. So I actually find getting to the 45-minute, I'm still working on that. But when I first was trying to put it together for doing it for the Fringe Festival, I worked on it for about 8 months, and I had a bunch of open rehearsals. So I had invited audiences where I told the story, and then I would ask them questions that I needed answered. Like, I'm thinking of the first open rehearsal I did where I was just like, oh my God, I'm really going to say this out loud to people. And one of my questions was, do I need to tell you more specifics about the event itself? And their responses were, no. Thank you. No, we do not need you to get any closer to the event itself. And then they asked me questions, and all of the questions they asked me made it absolutely clear to me that I did have to get closer to the event itself, because their questions were looking for escape hatches. They were looking for doors out of this actually being rape. And it wasn't anybody saying, oh, this wasn't rape, but it was things like, well, but if you had that much to drink, how do you even remember what happened? And, well, if he was drinking, then somehow if he was drinking, it wasn't rape. I don't know. Somebody had that thought. And so I had to go back into the story and actually get much closer to the event. I mean, I'm still not incredibly graphic about it, but I have to go much closer to it so that I can close all those escape doors. So those open rehearsals were really, really important for me. I did one open rehearsal for a bunch of therapists, and what they asked me afterwards was, could you put somewhere in the story what the gift of this experience was for you? And my essential response, though I was much gentler in how I said it to them, was, no, I'm not putting in what the gift is. I can say, and I do say in the story, that I've stopped the what ifing, and that I like the person that I am now. And I know that part of me was shaped by having been through this experience. But I'm not going to talk about the gift of the experience, because that implies to survivors that they need to be finding a gift in the experience for themselves. And I'm never going to be, that whole thing of like, the Chinese character for crisis is the same as opportunity. That is often offered by people who really, really don't want to deal with your crisis and want you to get on to the opportunity. And but it was really interesting to hear what different audiences said they needed.
Thank you.
Anybody else? What
I
a
know
wonderful
I
presentation.
threw a lot at people.
What a powerful story, and I'm very interested in you also hearing you talk about the deconstruction of shame, because I think it's that shame that keeps us quiet and hidden away, and I'm wondering if you've done a story after the bump, and that focuses on the deconstruction of shame.
I keep waffling on whether or not I want to actually talk meta-narratively about deconstructing shame in the story while I'm telling the story. I do the deconstruction of shame, but I don't know if I want to make it visible that that's what I'm doing. Because I'm trying so hard to model not feeling shame that I don't want to bring up that I have felt shame over these things. So I haven't done that. I do it in classes. Like last spring, I taught a class on telling difficult stories, and we talked about that quite a bit, because the people in the class had a lot of different kinds of difficult stories, and all of them needed to deconstruct shame to be able to tell them. So I did a bunch of that in that class. And I also teach a workshop on listening to hard stories that I do for therapists and forensic interviewers and parole officers, and just the people who are in situations to hear hard stories about how do we actually take them in? How do we listen to them non-judgmentally? And I use all the same principles that I use for how you tell stories, but it's how you actually are there as a role of listener, trying to help the person who is telling the story, as opposed to the teller trying to help the audience.
I took lots of notes. They're very instructive, and I think it's for me. I think one of the things that I was listening for was how to be a part of a hard conversation that doesn't try to steal the conversation or keep it from happening, or I think how to listen for understanding, not just to get an agenda across, I think is, and how to let somebody else know that it's a space for that to happen.
I just talked about that in my public speaking class on Monday night.
Man, I wish I'd been there. I need that right now.
Listening to understand versus listening to respond.
Yeah, I am.
Yeah.
So is there something I could read? Have you written an article about that I could read?
Actually, in our public speaking book, and I can send you the link for it and tell you what page to look at. There's a really good excerpt from Doug Lipman, who's a storyteller and story coach, where he talks about the way that he listens to people when they're telling him stories. And it's, I agree with everything in it. I was rereading it. I was like, oh, Doug, because I know Doug. Doug's in our public speaking book. This is very exciting. And I essentially highlighted it for my students and said, this is what I would teach you. So I can send you a link for that.
I'll send you an email and to make it easy to do that. Thank you so much. But thank you so much for sharing this.
I think Rebecca has a question too.
Do you ever provide that workshop for students?
How to listen to hard stories? I can.
I think that would be great. I know a lot of graduate students would be interested in that. I would be interested in that.
Yeah. No, I can do that. I've done a workshop for students on doing peer education and doing peer education around this topic. And what are some of the do's and don'ts of peer education. It's not a huge area of expertise for me, but I'm able to talk about refraining from judgment. The thing I didn't talk about today is I have a scene in the story where I've finally been given the word rape, and I decide to tell somebody in my family, and I tell my brother that I was closest to at the time. And after a long silence, he changes the subject, like I hadn't said anything. And I finally had to come up with a way to allow grace and compassion for him in the story while still having the impact of his doing that clear for how it was on me. And that was something that took me a long time to figure out. And I finally figured out how to do that. And a lot of the things that I teach in storytelling is how to describe behavior without passing judgment on behavior. Because if you're passing judgment, you're shaming somebody.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, Rebecca, I would be happy to do that workshop for students.
I think that'd be great.
Or for people in the counseling center for that matter.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Well, I guess we're out of time, but that was just compelling. I mean, I just couldn't stop listening. It was really compelling. So
thank you for the invitation to share. I really spent time trying to think about, of all the things that I could talk about for women's gender and sexuality studies, what is something that will be beneficial to people. And this is what I landed on. So,
and this will be a great recording to have too on our website. So, gosh, thank you so much.
You're welcome
for taking time. Thanks to the people who could come today. And so I guess we'll bye, Wesley.
Thank you again.
Yes.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
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 Hey, Phyllis, can I ask you something?
Phyllis
She's
left.
gone.
I'm trying to save the chat and it's not giving me a way to save.
I saved it.
Okay. Usually there's a way you can save it and it's not letting me do that.
I did it. I can send it to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you,
And
Judy. I'm glad
I'll
this was useful.
It was wonderful. So I want to know whatever happened to Eddie.
He went on to become
A congressman, just tell me.
a county sheriff, and actually was on sexual assault response team,
Oh my gosh.
which just horrified me when I found that out. But I actually, before I graduated, I confronted him. I had moved away from, and this is in the longer story, I had moved away from the Be a Better Friend and had entered a pretend he's not there phase, but that often meant pretend I'm not there because he was so very present. So it was erasing myself. But before he graduated, I confronted him and said, I just want you to know that you raped me. And he was all blustery. Oh, I know the first. And I was like, no. I know you're not going to agree with me. I just want you to know that I know that you raped me. And I kept repeating it and repeating it and repeating it to me, repeating it until he had nothing to say. And maybe a year later, I got a birthday card from him that was like a child's birthday card, with a little line in there saying, if I caused you any pain, I'm sorry. So I think it wasn't taking responsibility for his actions. And I wasn't like, oh, he's magically turned into a better person, but it was something. One of the reactions I get to this story a lot that is profoundly upsetting to me is people who want to push towards forgiveness. You don't have anything about forgiveness in your story. And what about forgiving Eddie? And there are people who really, really, really want to push that. And I talk about the difference between forgiveness and acceptance, because they keep telling me that I have to forgive for my own benefit. And I'm like, no, I accepted that this happened for my own benefit, that it's not something I'm still trying to change. It's not something, I don't walk around with a big pile of anger at him in me, because that would only hurt me. But forgiveness would actually require some remorse on his part. And I don't feel the need to forgive somebody who hasn't asked for it.
Right.
But it's amazing how many people really, really want me to get to the forgiveness place and be very strong about it in the story. And I see that as another subset of the crisis is the same as opportunity. Can we move to the opportunity place?
And it still sort of puts blame on you.
Yeah. It puts responsibility on me.
Yeah. And it's not your responsibility to forgive.
So it's interesting to me, the responses I get. And I often do Q&As after the show. So I get a lot of responses. And I'm very honest in how I answer them. I'm respectful of people and what they say, but I'm very honest in how I respond in Q&As.
Well, this was very helpful. I actually have to tell my story at the end of next month, and I've never done it before, so I've been freaking out. Like, not that I haven't told it interpersonally so many times. So this was helpful to start categorizing how I'm going to tell it.
Who are you going to tell it to? Who's your audience?
The Johnson City Recovery Center. They're doing a All Pathways to Recovery story share once a month.
Oh.
And so I'll be the speaker for this month now, I guess.
Yeah.
It's this month now.
Yeah. And that's really different than just I'm telling it to a therapist.
Yeah, it's different. And like I tell it all the time because I do smart recovery meetings, and I'm like, so it's not that I'm uncomfortable. I think it's they want me to talk for an hour. And I'm like, what? That means I got to tell you everything.
Oh, you'd be surprised at what you have to cut still to fit in an hour.
Yeah.
Because these stories are so complex.
Yes.
Well, good luck. Good luck doing that.
Yeah, you've already out.
If you want to take an hour sometime and sit and go through an outline with it, you can reach out to me. And if I'm in the middle of doing my third year reviews, so I'm a little crunched for time right now, but I'd be happy to sit with you for an hour and go over an outline if that would be of use to you.
Okay, thank you. I might take you up on that.
Okay. All right. Thank you again, Nancy. We really appreciate it.